I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Meagan Hatcher-Mays, the Director of Democracy Policy for the Indivisible Project. Meagan joins me to discuss D.C. statehood and the recent historic vote in the House of Representatives to grant statehood to the District of Columbia. If this bill were to be approved by the Senate, D.C., of course, would become the 51st state in the nation. So here is my conversation with Meagan Hatcher-Mays. Meagan Hatcher-Mays, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So DC statehood, right? The bill passed in the House. I think it was last week. It was recently, right? As expected. It was expected to pass in the House. And it will most likely go to the Senate where, good bills go to die.
Correct.
The Senate has been frozen for a decade, right? I don't know. Why is this even politicized?
That's a good question. Basically, what's going on here is that DC, small but mighty, what we lack in square footage, we make up for with population. There's about 700,000 people who live in the District of Columbia, and most of the people who live here are not white. Actually, up until recently, the majority of the people living in the city were Black people. And, anytime you have a situation where enfranchising a lot of Black people are on the table, it raises Republicans' hackles, right? They don't like that. So they don't want to grant us statehood, one, because we are a majority non-white city, and two, because we tend to vote for Democrats when we elect people to elected office here in DC and in Congress. We do have a non-voting delegate in Congress. We typically elect Democrats or progressives. So this is politicized because the Senate, which kind of disproportionately gives power to a shrinking, ideological minority, it tends to overrepresent small, rural, mostly white states, which is great for Republicans, but bad for everybody else. When you start to talk about weakening that conservative stranglehold over the Senate and giving more power to progressives, Black people, and people of color, it tends to make Republicans pretty upset.
Right. I hadn't thought about it this way until you just mentioned it. So if DC were a state, right, it would be, I think, the only state in the union with the majority of Black residents. Like you have Georgia, for instance, which has a higher percentage of Black residents than in comparison to other states. The city of Atlanta has a large number of Black residents. But as far as the states are concerned, if it were a state, it would have, I think, is that right? The majority of Black residents?
It would be plurality Black. So right now, because of gentrification and a lot of other factors, the Black population in DC has shrunk from well above 50% to just under 50. So now the city is about 47% Black, but it's still majority not white. So it's majority Black people and people of color and fewer white people. So it would be the only state in the union that was plurality Black, which is a huge deal. There's no other state that would have quite that high a percentage of Black people living in it in the country.
Right. No, I just thought about that because you were talking about cities versus states. So you'd basically turn the city into a state, and that would be, wow, unprecedented, actually.
We're small, but we have more people living here than live in Wyoming, that live in Vermont. There are other small states. Rhode Island is very small and Hawaii is very small. Square footage is not how we decide whether or not a place should be a state. And I think we are in good shape to become a state. We have lots of people that live here. We have a very diverse citizenry and economy. I think, we're ready to go. We're ready to be a state.
Right. Well, you have, just under 750,000 residents, right? Like you mentioned, it's quite a large population. And you pay taxes, right?
Yes, we pay a lot of taxes.
Right, exactly. So, with that in mind, how is this even legal? The whole taxation without representation thing. How is this even legal?
Yeah, for folks who have visited DC or people may have seen, that's on our license plate. No taxation without representation. That's the promise of this country, is that you should have, if you pay taxes here, you should have a say in how those tax dollars are spent. But we don't. We pay more in federal taxes per capita than anywhere else in the country, and we pay more total in federal taxes than 22 other states. DC residents are pulling their weight in this country, and yet we have no say over how that money is actually spent in Congress. Now, it's legal. I think no taxation without representation is a promise, but it's not a guarantee. But that's the fight. That's the fight that DC residents have been waging for decades, to get some say in how our money is spent.
Right. I'm just curious as to, why this wasn't pursued sooner, right? I don't know if this bill has ever come to the floor before, but,
It did once. Back in 1993, for the first time ever, there was a vote on DC statehood. Back in 1993, our non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, had introduced the bill. She's still our delegate, still our only representative in Congress, and she has no vote. But it failed. Even a bunch of Democrats voted against DC statehood. And a lot of them made a lot of the same arguments that Republicans make now in opposition to DC statehood. So this vote that happened on June 26th was the first time that the DC statehood bill had ever in the history of our country passed either chamber of Congress, and it passed the House, and it was great. And actually some of the Democrats who were in the House in 1993 are still around, and they all voted yes on DC statehood. So it's been a huge, huge shift in the popularity of statehood, or the acknowledgement that this is a problem. I mean, I think it's been a huge shift in the Democratic Party alone. Now, we haven't gotten any Republicans to join this bill yet, but just getting every single Democrat but one to vote yes on DC statehood is a huge, huge, massive victory, because, anybody who was around in 1993 would not take that for granted at all.
Wait, who didn't vote? Tell me.
It was Colin Peterson of Minnesota, which is not surprising. He tends to vote badly a lot of the time. He votes with Donald Trump quite a bit. I want to say he voted badly on impeachment too, but I actually don't remember that off the top of my head. But he's a very conservative Democrat. It's not necessarily surprising that he voted against it, but it is surprising that some of the other conservative Democrats didn't join him in that vote. I think I never would have guessed that some of the more conservative, like more moderates, like Jim Cooper of Tennessee, he's often voted to overturn DC local laws, and he's a Democrat. He's supposed to be our friend. He voted in favor of DC statehood. He had voted against it back in 1993. So this was a huge, huge moment. And, you were saying at the top that this bill is going to go to die in the Senate, which it will. Mitch McConnell has called DC statehood full bore socialism because,
we'll talk about that later.
Enfranchising 700,000 people is bad now. And it will go to die there, but I don't want to gloss over this huge moment of getting that many Democrats at least to validate the fight for statehood. It was just a huge, huge moment. It was amazing to watch.
I mean, I don't know. You're saying that, and I guess I just don't really know the history of this that well. But I'm thinking 1993. Of course, all Democrats would have voted. I just don't. You've kind of blown my mind there. Like, what arguments were made on the Democratic side in 1993 against DC statehood?
A lot of those arguments we would now clock as very conservative arguments. DC's too small. DC doesn't know how to manage its finances. We can't trust DC officials, because they're too corrupt. Now, fortunately for most members of Congress, state and local corruption does not preclude you from becoming a state, which is good news for their home states. But whatever. And there's lots of excuses as to why DC shouldn't be a state, but there really is no legitimate reason against it. And it's just been decades of grassroots advocacy that has brought all of these Democrats around. It was a ton of work to get them there. And, a lot of it was personal. Steny Hoyer, who is now second in command in the House, he's from Maryland. He also voted against DC statehood back in 1993 because he didn't want DC, if DC ever became a state, we would be allowed to tax Maryland residents. We would be able to charge them a toll, say, if they commuted from Maryland into DC. And so he voted against it because he was trying to protect his constituents from the added cost of commuting into the district. So, and he voted yes this time. That's a huge, huge victory. And it's really crazy that a bunch of Democrats were on the wrong side of history back in 1993, but they got there, but they didn't get there without a lot of work, a lot of effort.
Yeah. Thinking about that story you just told me about Steny Hoyer, just thinking about it, he does have an election that he wanted to win, right? I'm not playing devil's advocate, but I'm just trying to get into the mindset of someone who would vote that way, right? Because in 1993, had the vote passed and, DC had been made a state, even in 1993, that would have benefited Democrats nationally, right? I mean, considering the population of DC, it would have benefited them, but he had to make a choice. Just, him just picking on him right now. He had to make a choice about how his constituents would view that and whether he'd be punished or not with re-election.
Yeah, it was a hyper-local concern, I think, for him at the time. And I won't lie, actually, to your point about, kind of what's changed between now and then. I mean, I think the biggest thing that's changed is Donald Trump. I think Democrats have been very wary in the past of doing things that look like they're trying to grab power, to do like a power grab. And a lot of people thought, I think at the time, that that's what that would look like to the American people. If we made DC a state, that's a power grab because they would elect 2 Democratic senators to the Senate if they became a state. And that's quote unquote unfair. But I think what Donald Trump has shown is that actually, people who are kind of left-leaning, liberal-minded actually are the majority of the people in this country, but they are not the majority of the people that make up the Senate. There's really only one way to fix that problem, and that's by making the Senate more representative of America as a whole by creating more states. And you kind of have to start with DC when you are having that conversation.
Yeah. So can you talk about, historically, some of the arguments that were made earlier in the 20th century against DC statehood? Because some of them were just blatantly racist.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and this goes back hundreds of years. I mean, historically, DC has been a majority Black jurisdiction. And the reason for that is because Lincoln actually emancipated slaves in the district about 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. So immediately, hundreds, if not thousands, of Black people in the district became free. And then DC became a really popular place for recently freed, or even in some cases escaped slaves to go because they knew they could live there freely. And that's like the foundation for why our city became, it used to be known as Chocolate City because so many Black people lived here. Like, that's the reason. That's how it all started. So going back, 200 years, white conservative members of Congress are looking around thinking like, that's a lot of Black people. We cannot give these people political power because that will be bad for us. That will harm our interests as white, sometimes slave owning property owners. So this has been a long time project to deny political power to the district, just simply based on demographics, just simply based on the fact that lots of Black people lived here. Now, over the course of the years, that intention stayed the same, but they got a lot more clever and subtle in their messaging. So instead of just explicitly saying, I would like to deny Black people political power, they came up with a lot of other arguments as to why DC shouldn't be a state, none of which are particularly compelling. But that's how they do it now. I mean, this is really not long enough ago. I mean, this happened back in the 1960s. DC sent its first budget ever to Congress to be approved. And a white conservative lawmaker responded to our Black mayor with a cart full of watermelons in response to this budget. I mean, this has been going on for years. And now, most recently, how this manifests is you have senators like Tom Cotton, who just the other day gave some remarks where he said, well, Wyoming is a real state. It's working class. We have lots of miners, or Wyoming has a lot of miners and real people, real working class type of people. DC doesn't have that. I mean, that's like the loudest dog whistle you can imagine, like what Tom Cotton is really talking about when he says Wyoming and working class. Everybody knows Wyoming is overwhelmingly white. So nothing has changed except the language that they use. I mean, those historical arguments denying political power to the District of Columbia, it's all rooted in race, quite frankly. And so when you hear senators talking about, working class people here deserve representation, but these people in DC don't, that's really what they're saying. That's really what they're talking about.
Yeah. We could have a whole episode just talking about, how one defines working class, specifically conservatives, right? When they say working class, what they mean is white, because, working in a restaurant, that's working class, is it not?
You would think so, but not if you're Tom Cotton, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So those are some of the arguments that were made today. And historically, let's talk about Mitch McConnell's comment, socialism. Did he ever, what was his comment actually? What was the quote exactly?
He said that DC statehood is tantamount to full-bore socialism. So
now, did he explain that?
Well, the argument he's trying to advance is that Democrats are trying to do a power grab. So like I said, our city is mostly not white. a lot of us who live here are progressives. I think Hillary Clinton won DC in the 2016 election 94%. Like she won 94% of the vote back in 2016. So yes, we elect Democrats here. So I think the point that Mitch McConnell was trying to make was that this is nothing more than a power grab by the Democrats. They don't actually care about DC statehood. They don't care about the promise of no taxation without representation. They merely care about taking over the Senate with socialists that would be elected by DC residents. It's obviously nonsense, but it is a way for him to kind of whip up their base into a frenzy about granting voting rights to 700,000 mostly not white people who live in a big city, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's amazing because it actually has nothing. I mean, there's no connection to socialism whatsoever, but that word has just become a scary word. Mm-hmm. You can say anything is socialism, right? Police reform is socialism. You know, yeah.
And they do that. They do that for nearly every single progressive priority is socialist. So, you know, you can just kind of tune it out, but it does have real world effects for the people that live here. I mean, you know, as we've been talking about, this victory in the House was so hard fought to get to this point, and to know that it's just kind of go to the Senate and be ignored, and that Republicans are going to go out of their way to kind of undermine this fight in the Senate. It's a hard pill to swallow for sure, but it's not the end of the story at all.
Yeah. So I get the connection as to why they don't want DC to be a state. Now, we've talked about, you know, Democrats historically not wanting that, but now, you know, most Democrats except that one person, you know, they're voting for this. But I still haven't made the connection as to, you know, the logical argument they're making for their voters nationally.
I guess the argument for Republicans is not so much, hey, voters, you should care about DC statehood on the merits. It's more like you should care about to the extent that you already hate Democrats, you should hate them for this too, because you should view this as a power grab, even though that's not what this is about. Like, this is not about trying to steal power that doesn't belong to us. This is about sharing in the promise of what this country is supposed to be, which is everybody gets a say in how the country is run. And right now, the United States is not living up to its promise for the people that live in its capital city, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure that Republican voters really care about DC statehood on the merits. What I think that Republican members of Congress are banking on is that they will perceive it as being socialism, as being some sort of unfair deal, you know, that sort of thing, even though it really isn't any of those things.
Yeah. You know, I think what we just heard here in my last question is that their arguments for anything, you know, that would expand democracy, they're becoming so irrational that even, you know, trying to have a discussion about them, an intellectual discussion, your brain just gets tangled. Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on here? I can't even explain the argument against it because it doesn't make any sense.
It's all totally bad faith. And I think for anyone who watched the debate on the House floor over the DC statehood bill, the Republican side they had nothing. They were really grasping at straws because there are no good faith arguments to oppose DC statehood. There just aren't. And they know that. And they know it's not the 1800s anymore, so they can't just be explicitly racist. And so instead they come up with other stuff like, you know, no real people live in DC, or there's no working class people in DC. But it didn't work this time, at least not for the House vote.
Yeah. You know, I actually did not watch it. And you did watch it, obviously. Did anyone just come out and, you know, call their bluff and just say, hey, you know, this is about race on the Democratic side?
Oh, yeah. Many Democrats pointed it out. Yeah. And I was very glad about that because I think, you know, Democrats don't always have the courage to talk about racial justice issues sometimes. But this time they did. And it was really heartening to see because this is not because I think you just really need to call it like it is. This is not about whether or not statehood is constitutional. It is. That's another argument Republicans make. If this is not about whether or not DC can raise enough tax revenue, that's not a real problem. We can raise enough tax revenue. It's not about any of that stuff. It's not about the health of DC's economy, which is doing just great, by the way. It's about this other thing. It is about the fact that this city is historically Black. It is about the fact that this city is mostly Democrats, and they don't want to give up any power, especially when the system benefits Republicans so disproportionately. So that's what this is about. And the Democrats did a fantastic job at making that point on the House floor.
Yeah, you're right. And, I'm a Democrat. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I'm Black, by the way, which you may or may not know. but I was raised in a Southern Black family. So it's obviously I'm a Democrat. We all were. And, I can say that I agree with you. This level of openness and allegiance to causes like Black Lives Matter and, calling things for what they are, like, this House vote on the DC statehood bill, and, just, everyone, not just the Black members of Congress, but everyone, or a lot of people except that one guy, they are speaking up on race. And this moment, I don't know, I know people are saying it feels very different, but I do feel like, we are, I don't know how to articulate it, heading into a new era of openness in talking about race on the political level.
Yeah, I think that you're right about that. This does feel really different to me. And, like you, I've lived through dozens of flashpoints like this where a Black person was murdered at the hands of police, like just plainly stating what goes on. And this has happened way too many times for either of us to count. But something about this does feel really, really different. Like the sustained momentum of the protests, of the marches, I think really has changed things. It kind of remains to be seen how it will manifest, but I actually think the DC statehood bill is one really clear example of how the left's commitment to racial justice manifested. Like, I think that's a very, really good example of it. I don't think that vote for DC statehood would have happened on the 26th if there had not been weeks of Black Lives Matter protests leading up to that moment. I think the reason for that is, I think particularly in DC, now the fact that we're not a state means that we have kind of second class status. And one of the ways that reveals itself is that the federal government has a lot of authority over like the day-to-day operations of the city. There's a ton of federal law enforcement in the city, and they have jurisdiction all over in ways that they would not have in other states. So like, for example, in Washington state, the military can't just show up unannounced and clear you out of a protest. That violates the Constitution. In DC, the federal government can do that. And we saw Donald Trump do that. So on one of the first nights of the protests, he sent out United States Park Police. These are federal officers who have jurisdiction over national parks. The park right across the street from the White House is technically a national park. He sent them in alongside local police and other federal law enforcement officers, as well as military personnel, to clear out that park using tear gas and violence, all so that he could go get a photo opportunity in front of a church that's right over there. This could not happen anywhere else but DC because of the authority that the president has over law enforcement in the District of Columbia. So we have had a sustained military presence in our city because we are not a state, because we don't have full autonomy over our own affairs. And people notice that really viscerally in a way that they don't always notice how the federal government interferes with DC. This was such a plain and violent and kind of explosive example of the ways that the federal government messes with us. The only solution to this problem is to become a state. And so I don't think that the statehood vote would have happened without all those protests. I just really don't. I think that people finally got a sense of what it is we go through as DC residents, what we have to put up with, especially if there's a Republican in the White House. That's what we deal with every day. And it only happens because we're not a state.
Right. Thank you for mentioning that, because I actually did not understand that. And I think a lot of people in other parts of the country were kind of flummoxed as to how he could deploy the police and, the military into a park for a peaceful protest. And we were just like, how could that happen? How is that legal? I mean, he's doing a lot of things that aren't legal. Yes. A lot of people were confused by that.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the kind of hidden downsides of living in DC, that, there's actually a provision in the law too that gives the president authority to federalize our local police, which he did not do. But it's really scary to think that somebody as kind of unhinged as Donald Trump having that kind of authority to basically weaponize our local police force as well, in addition to like a literal actual military agents that he called in to clear out a peaceful protest. It's really, really scary. We also, here in DC, we don't have a local prosecutor. Our local crimes are prosecuted by the Department of Justice, which means that Donald Trump gets to pick the person who prosecutes our local crimes, like somebody who commits like a local offense here in DC will get prosecuted by a Department of Justice attorney. So mass incarceration is a problem everywhere. It's a problem here in DC too. And there's pretty much nothing we can do about any of that, since the president gets to pick the person who prosecutes the crimes and sends people to jail. It's like that's what we're dealing with here now that since we're not a state.
So back on the idea of this being a moment that's very different, right? And I think that you're right about the DC statehood vote probably would not have happened, but for the national protests, the sustained national protests, and they're worldwide too, which is also really surprising. But then secondly, Pennsylvania Avenue, has Black Lives Matter, painted in block letters across the street. So I'm just curious, what is it like there now? Is it still militarized? Do you still have this presence there? What's going on?
Yeah, people are still social distancing, but actually the turnout for the protests has been incredibly high. I went out to a few myself, and I was pleasantly surprised at the number of people that I saw. And I was really, really impressed with how seriously people at the protest, this is a side point, but I was really, really impressed with how seriously people took social distancing, wearing masks. I didn't see anybody take a mask off the entire time they were at the protest. So even though we're technically supposed to be staying at home, lots of people think that these protests are worth the risk because of how unjust these killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others have been.
Where does this go from here? If this is going to die in the Senate, right, which is unfortunate because it's taken so long to get the votes, even on the Democratic side, where do we go from here? Let's assume that, Democrats take the Senate, in November, hopefully, and the White House. But if they don't, how will we have the momentum to carry this into November or beyond? And if not, what are some other ways to get this passed?
Yes, we have the momentum. If we win back the Senate and we win the White House, we have a very good chance of making DC the 51st state. It's going to be a lot of work still. Not every Democrat currently in the Senate is a co-sponsor of the DC statehood bill. So there's some work to do still on the Senate side. And that is Indivisible's plan, at least for the next few months for sure. But the goal is to get as much support behind DC statehood, both as a matter of democracy and also as a racial justice issue, so that we can hit the ground running in January 2021 and really get serious about making this happen for real. If we do not win back the Senate, or if we don't win back the White House, I think we'll have bigger problems on our hands than DC statehood. But the scenario in which, Joe Biden wins in November, but say we don't win back the Senate, then the big fight becomes winning back the Senate in 2022. There's still a chance. Actually, the math looks a lot better for Democrats in 2022 than it does this year. So the fight doesn't end just because we don't win back the Senate. In fact, I think it would really imbue the fight going forward that, this is really a chance to win back the Senate, do something that will make the Senate more democratic, little d democratic, and really make sure that this country is working for everyone and not just a small few.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is a naive question, but it just seems like this is something that would go to the Supreme Court at some point, Yeah. I don't know.
Well, there's been lots of challenges in the past. None have been successful. But if DC became a state, that would be challenged in court. As I mentioned, sometimes Republicans like to say that, statehood is unconstitutional. It is not unconstitutional, but just because I think so doesn't mean that the conservative Supreme Court justices will agree with me on that. So for sure, if it becomes law and we start the process of making DC the 51st state, some Republican somewhere will challenge that law and it will go to the courts. But I feel really good about that case. And also, that'd be a good problem to have, because that would mean that it passed the House and the Senate and the president signed it into law. So I'd take it.
Yeah, me too. Well, Meagan Hatcher-Mays, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for all of your work and your activism. I really appreciate you. And I'll be watching this.
Thank you so much for having me.